Good day. Today is Thursday, 17th July 2025, and we're just a few days from President Trump's announcement on Monday when he spoke about this new arrangement that he had agreed with NATO, whereby the United States would be supplying weapons to Ukraine via NATO, with the European states paying for those weapons. And of course, he also spoke about how if the Russians did not come to a deal over Ukraine within 50 days, he would impose 100% tariffs on Russia and also 100% tariffs on Russia's various trading partners, with China apparently particularly in his sights. Well, that was on Monday. Today, Thursday, the first part of that statement, the part that related to the arms deliveries to Ukraine, is looking increasingly shaky. I say that because it's becoming increasingly clear that this agreement, this arrangement, was set up very much in a hurry over the course of a few quick telephone calls, two in particular, one between Trump and Zelensky, the second between Trump and Merz, and that most of the countries in NATO were not informed or consulted about it in advance. They were not asked to give their views. So yesterday I discussed at some length how France has always made clear that it's not prepared to go along with this plan. And I said that it was the fact that France would never agree to any kind of arrangement where weapons from the United States were bought by the EU for forward transmission to Ukraine, that it was this objection from France which almost certainly was what caused the parties that agreed to the NATO arrangement, basically Trump, Zelensky, Merz and Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, to decide that it should be NATO that would act as the vehicle to buy the weapons and to transfer them to Ukraine. But most NATO states, it seems, were not consulted and they're not happy. And over the course of yesterday, reports circulated that two NATO states, Italy and the Czech Republic, had opted out of the scheme. And if that is true, and I believe it is true certainly of Italy, it is likely that Spain will follow. Spain has resisted Donald Trump's demand that it spend 5% of its GDP on weapons, on defense. So that makes it unlikely, I would have thought, that Spain would agree to a scheme like this, which would also amount to Spain essentially paying the United States for weapons which would be supplied to an entirely different country, to Ukraine, in fact. And that means that as of the time of making this program, this package comes down to a small group: Germany, Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium apparently, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and the Baltic states. A small group of states in Northern Europe. Now, not all of them, I suspect, are going to be able to write the checks. Britain is going through a major budgetary crisis, and there are concerns about tax increases later this year. And we've also just going through a scandal in Britain, a very complicated scandal, which I'm not going to discuss in detail, but it relates to the disclosure in error, a leak in error by the British Defence Ministry of a document that identified various Afghans who had worked with the British Armed Forces in Afghanistan before the American and British withdrawal from that country. There's been a huge scandal about this because the British government attempted to conceal this leak, even though there is reason to believe that the Taliban, who presumably were the intended people from whom this information should be concealed, did in fact know about it and did in fact have some of this information. Anyway, the British government concealed what had happened by obtaining a court order basically prohibiting all publication of this document, all disclosures of its contents, any admission that the document even existed, and incredibly, even an admission that the order itself had been made to conceal the existence of this document. Now, this was creating a lot of protests and complaints in Britain, but for the purpose of this program, the point I want to make is that it seems that the High Court judge, who was repeatedly asked to extend this order, he was not, by the way, the judge who originally made the order. That was another judge, but the judge to whom the case was passed and who continued to make the order thereafter. Anyway, he finally balked back in November when he learned that the total bill, the total cost of trying to rescue these people whose identities had been disclosed in Afghanistan and to bring them to Britain and to resettle them there, was reaching something in the region of £7 billion. And the judge said, and he was absolutely right to say it, that he didn't feel it was proper or correct that the government should be spending money on that scale without this being properly debated in Parliament or Parliament being informed about what was happening. Now, the point is that what we've seen is that on top of all of the other spending problems that the government has had, the money it's been sending to Ukraine, and by the way, here I'm talking, when I say the British government, I mean both the outgoing Conservative government and the current Labour government. They are both equally implicated in this affair. Anyway, both of these governments, both Conservative and Labour British governments, of course, have been shoveling money at Ukraine and sending large numbers of weapons to Ukraine and have been stripping British inventories of weapons because of the amount of weapons they've been sending to Ukraine. But they have also been running into a budgetary crisis. And of course, over the last few months, that budgetary crisis in Britain has crystallized, and we've now learned that perhaps, I don't have the full details of the story as I make this program, perhaps one of the reasons why this crisis has crystallized in the way that it has done is because the British government has had to spend £7 billion to try to make up for this event which took place, this leak of this information about the Afghans who worked for Britain. And this was done, apparently, without Parliament or the British public even being informed. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that Britain is in a very, very bad fiscal situation. Things are getting worse. It's likely that taxes are going to be increased in the autumn. The economy contracted in May and June. Unemployment rates are rising. I cannot imagine at this time that the British government has the fiscal space to start writing checks for American weapons which are going to be supplied to Ukraine. Ukraine, the conflict there, has been given an obsessive, overriding priority, both by the current Labour government, by Keir Starmer, and by the previous Conservative government. But I am going to guess that the limits have now been reached. I think that, quite apart from the fact that further big spending on arms purchases for Ukraine from the United States would be financially incredibly difficult, I think that given the realities, it is also going to be politically impossible. It will be a very hard sell to the British people that Britain is giving money to the Americans, to Donald Trump, as some people will say, and Donald Trump is deeply unpopular in Britain, in order to help Ukraine, even as taxes in Britain rise and welfare spending and health spending and other types of spending are cut. So what that inevitably means is that, given that the Scandinavian states, which are rich countries and which do have some fiscal space and which are indeed fervid supporters of Ukraine, but given that they're small countries, inevitably, going back to the topic of my program yesterday, most of the money on these weapons is going to have to be paid by Germany. I cannot see how else this can happen. Friedrich Merz may have told the Americans, may have told Donald Trump that Europe will pay, but the reality is that it is Germany that is going to pay. And of course, Germany itself, as we all know, has its economic problems. And I explained in my program yesterday why, far from all of the additional spending on weapons facilitating re-industrialization in Germany, the fact that weapons are now going to be bought from the United States, initially for Ukraine, but ultimately, I am sure, for Germany also, that inevitably is going to lead to further de-industrialization in Germany. Anyway, all of that takes us to the underlying problem with this entire scheme, which is that absolutely nothing has yet been sorted out. I made the point from the moment it first was broached by Trump that there is no contract, no public documents, no points of agreement, letters of agreement, let alone proper contracts or anything of that kind. By the way, and given that we are talking about an agreement to buy weapons, I presume that it will have to be placed before the German parliament and they will have to debate it. Just saying. Anyway, given that we have no agreement, no framework agreement in place to do this thing, it all is unbelievably vague at the moment. And as a number of commentators are now pointing out, given that offensive weapons are not being sent and pretty much all other types of weapons are not being sent either, we are reduced to air defense systems. That seems to be the only thing that the United States is even talking about sending now. But of course, the United States has already admitted that it is desperately short of air defense systems. The United States continues to scrounge around the world trying to find Patriot missiles that it can send to Ukraine. The Crown Prince of Bahrain apparently is in the United States. Donald Trump has asked him whether he has any Patriot missile systems to spare that he could give to Ukraine. Bahrain has said no. And I predict and expect that more and more countries are going to do that. There is no enthusiasm for this scheme in Europe. There are already wobbles and complaints about it, apparently, in Germany. Merz is already becoming increasingly unpopular with members of the CDU, his own party, who are unhappy with the outsized role the SPD, the coalition partner, is taking in the coalition, and are furious with the proposed nominee of a liberal justice, a liberal law professor, as a member of the Constitutional Court, something that Merz has had to put on hold. Anyway, this part of Donald Trump's great plan, as of today, looks to be in very bad shape. There's no sign that any air defense missiles for the moment are being sent to Ukraine. There were some reports yesterday that Germany was now delivering Patriot missiles to Ukraine, but the German Defense Ministry denied the fact. They said that so far there's been no decision to send any, and none, in fact, have been sent. So, for the moment, a plan outlined by Donald Trump, supported by Mark Rutte, supported by Friedrich Merz, but the French, the Italians, apparently the Czechs, before long I'm sure the Spanish are pulling out. The British can't do very much. Germany is being left to do it by itself, essentially, and it isn't even in place or even working. It could take months to work out, to set out the agreements, to get, I presume, the Bundestag and the other parliaments in Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, wherever, to agree to this. It could take weeks and months for it to happen. There will be delays, there will be arguments, and of course in the meantime the war continues. As for the other part of Donald Trump's Monday announcement, the part about sanctions and tariffs, you're getting more articles published, including a long one in the New York Times, commenting on the fact that the Russians seem to be completely unabashed, unfazed by this massive sanctions tariff announcement. I've been looking at the movements in the Russian markets. The Russian stock market grew yesterday. It slightly declined this morning, but only very slightly, probably people cashing in on their gains of yesterday. The ruble continues to strengthen. There's been no major changes in the oil price. I don't think anybody takes this seriously. Probably some people in the Senate do, Lindsey Graham, but I think that the universal assumption in the markets is that Russian oil will continue to be traded, that some kind of deal will be done before the 50 days have run out, and that this isn't going to be implemented in the end. Now, that might be a complacent view, but anyway, that seems to be the general sentiment. As far as the Russians are concerned, I suspect that one of the reasons that they are unconcerned about this is because they've received assurances, private assurances from their trading partners that they will not abide by this tariff threat. Of course, Brazil is already facing 50% tariffs. So Another 100% on top presumably isn't going to make a huge amount of difference. China has already seen tariff challenges off before. India probably calculates that Trump is not really going to want to tariff India. But anyway, I think all of these countries, for their own separate reasons, have probably given the Russians private assurances that they're not going to change their policies in response to Trump's tariff threats. And of course, the Chinese have gone further. They've said so publicly. They made it very clear publicly that they are, in fact, that they're not, in fact, going to abide by these threats at all. In fact, they don't take kindly to them. As my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, has absolutely correctly said, the Chinese have actually been more outspoken in their criticisms of this sanctions and tariff announcement than the Russians have been themselves. The Russians continue to talk rather moderately. Lavrov has spoken about the pressures that Trump is under. Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's direct investment front, has spoken in the same way. Peskov has spoken very calmly about this. There's been no word so far from Putin himself. The Russians have taken it all very calmly. The Chinese, by contrast, have reacted more forcefully, and they made it absolutely clear that they will not abide by this threat. They consider it another bluff by Donald Trump. They intend to call it, and if it is not a bluff, they will take the same kind of retaliatory action, putting up counter tariffs, restricting exports of rare earths, the same kind of steps that they did in March and April. Now, before I continue, there's a few things I want to say here about this plan, which is that I think an important clue into what it is really about has now been provided by the former British diplomat Ian Proud. Now, Ian Proud has just written a further piece about this plan on his... oh dear, what's happened? A further piece about this plan. Now, Ian Proud has written a piece about this sanctions tariff plan on his Substack blog. Its title is Trump has backed himself into a corner on Ukraine. He now has 50 days to reach agreement on Ukrainian neutrality. It's the subtitle. But I think over the course of this article, he puts his finger on what this whole thing is really about. He says that the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 would put in place so-called secondary sanctions on Russia by imposing stiff tariffs of up to 500% against countries such as China and India that inter alia import Russian energy. This is Lindsey Graham's and Richard Blumenthal's proposal. This is the bone-crushing sanctions that they have been talking about and been talking about since April. And then Ian Proud continues, US lawmakers want to strong-arm Trump into forcing President Putin to back down in Ukraine via the back door. But there is a yawn-inducing sense of déjà vu here. The 2017 Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, signed into law on 2nd August 2017, had no impact on Russian policy towards Ukraine, but led to a huge collapse in US-Russia relations. And to make it absolutely clear, CAATSA, that act that dates from 2017, even though it was supposedly intended to empower the United States to act against all American enemies, it was primarily directed at Russia. That was absolutely clear at the time. And as Ian Proud correctly says, it led to a collapse. Its enactment led to a collapse in US-Russia relations. And he then points out that it then provoked the Russians into expelling 755 personnel from the US's Moscow embassy. And the article by Ian Proud then continues. To avoid a repeat of 2017, in other words, an act, the latest act proposed by Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham, to avoid a repeat of 2017, Trump now appears to be buying himself 50 days in Washington to reach peace in Ukraine before he is forced by the Senate to impose secondary sanctions on Russia. The July 14th announcement was therefore about domestic US foreign politics more than about foreign policy. And I think that is absolutely correct. But I think it goes even further than this. Because whilst CAATSA, the 2017 Act, countering American adversaries through Sanctions Act, did not change Russian policy, as Ian Proud absolutely correctly says, it destroyed any possibility of a rapprochement, a normalization of relations between the United States and Russia during Donald Trump's first term. If Donald Trump had taken any step during his first term to normalize relations with Russia, he would have run against the provisions of CAATSA, and he would quite plausibly have opened himself up to an impeachment which this time would have probably had support in the Senate. It seems to me that the true purpose of the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 being proposed by Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham is to do the same thing. Most probably, these senators, in fact, a majority of the Senate, know perfectly well that the Russians are not going to be deterred by this act from continuing with what they're doing in Ukraine. Probably they also understand that it is not going to crush the Russian economy and that the United States will not be able to implement many of these tariffs against Russian trading partners that the act threatens, and which of course Trump himself is now threatening. But what it almost certainly will do is make it impossible for the normalization of relations between Russia and the United States to take place. This whole process of negotiations that began back in March, the various meetings in Jeddah between Rubio and Lavrov, and subsequent meetings between Rubio and Lavrov, the meetings between the Americans and the Russians in Istanbul, all of those discussions to sort out the issues at the embassies, the diplomatic missions, to re-establish some kind of dialogue between the United States and Russia, to work towards a rapprochement, they will become impossible if this act is passed. And in fact, Rubio, the US Secretary of State, has actually said as much. One of the reasons he has tried, rather weakly, to push back against this act is that he has said that if the act is passed, then relations between Russia and the United States will again go back into the deep freeze, and any possibility of a negotiated ceasefire in the conflict in Ukraine will be irretrievably lost. So that is what Rubio says. Probably he reflects the general feeling within the administration on Donald Trump's own part, and I suspect it also reflects the mood in Moscow also. So when the New York Times says that the Russians are unfazed by the sanctions threat, they are. Their economy is structured to absorb the blow. I should say that Alex and I have done for the Duran a program about the Russian economy, which will be appearing in a few days, and which you could see, and which, in my opinion, sets out the real problems and challenges that it faces, which have very little to do with this act. Anyway, the Russians have reasons to believe and to be confident that they can absorb this challenge. The Chinese, who are the ones that matter, are not going to abide by it. They're not going to capitulate in the face of it. If the United States pulls back from imposing 100% tariffs on China, and how can it risk doing that again, given what happened in March and April, then I cannot imagine that it would take the extraordinary step of imposing tariffs like that on India, discriminating against India and in favor of China. I think that is just politically and diplomatically impossible. But what this act will do, even if the tariffs are not imposed, is that it will again short circuit, kill any possibility of a normalization of relations between Russia and the United States. And that, I think, is what Lindsey Graham wants. That is what Blumenthal wants. That's what a majority of the people in the Senate want. That is, of course, what the neocons want. That is what the military-industrial complex wants. That's what the intelligence community or parts of the intelligence community want, and the deep state and all of those people. They do not want to see a normalization of relations with Russia. They do not want to see Donald Trump walk away from Project Ukraine. And this act, when it is passed, will ensure that Donald Trump doesn't normalize relations and doesn't walk away from Ukraine. Now, in my opinion, Trump himself has brought this on himself. The time to have killed this bill was when it was first proposed back in April. He was politically at his strongest at that time. He is now in a much weaker position politically. He's quarrelled with Elon Musk. He's got issues with other parts of his base. He's published an astonishing comment on Truth Social, an incredibly unwise and reckless one, talking about some of his supporters as being his past supporters and calling the weaklings a statement which no politician, even one as unusual as Donald Trump, should ever make. He's in a much weaker position now, so he's had to take the step of giving the Russians this ultimatum to buy himself the 50 days. What he thinks he's going to be able to pull off in those 50 days is very difficult to see. The Russians, I get the impression, are not in any mood to give ground on anything. There was the article in Reuters that I discussed yesterday, which says this. There's been the follow-up article in the New York Times, which says exactly the same thing. So the Russians are not going to shift ground. Trump may hope that he can negotiate compromises with Lindsey Graham and with Blumenthal, and probably he can, but I suspect that they're going to continue to insist that the bill can retain the provision for congressional oversight. If he starts to walk back the tariffs that he's threatened for September, the bill will be activated. It will be impossible for him to stop it. And in effect, the neocons, Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal, will be in control of his foreign policy towards Russia. Fundamental problem in the United States is that individuals like Donald Trump do sometimes give the genuine impression of wanting to improve relations with Russia. And I think that my own view is that this was undoubtedly a good faith intention on Donald Trump's personal part. But this is not the prevailing view within the American political class, and it is absolutely not the prevailing view within the Senate. And the Senate is in a position to pull any president who thinks of normalization with Russia back onto the line of confrontation. And I think that is what is playing out. I cannot imagine that Trump himself is now in a position to pull back from this. I think that, as I said, we're unlikely to get the tariffs that have been threatened here, but the process of normalization with Russia, I think, is now coming effectively to an end. There will be some people in Moscow, quite a lot of people, who I think will be relieved. They do not believe that any attempt to normalize relations with the United States is going to be successful. They worry always that when such attempts are made, Russia gets led into making concessions, which it would be better for Russia if it did not make. Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, is the public spokesman of this group, which is getting stronger and which I suspect is going to feel vindicated. Putin himself, I believe, will regret this outcome. I've always felt that Putin ultimately does want some kind of normalization of relations with the United States. I've discussed this many times. I said this in many programs. I think Putin's ideal outcome would be one where Ukraine is defeated, where the current government in Kiev is changed, where it is replaced by a government that is much more friendly to Moscow, where the four regions are integrated into Russia, but a deal is done between Russia, Ukraine, and ultimately the United States, whereby the territorial arrangements are then recognized and Russia is able to feel security about its western borders so that it can concentrate all its energies on dealing with its own pressing domestic problems. I have discussed this in program after program. I think this remains Putin's preferred outcome, and I think that he still hoped that he could negotiate it with Donald Trump. My own view is that the prospect of that is now fading away. I think if the sanctions in any form start being brought into force in September, then they will fade further still. And of course, if the Sanctioning Russia Act is indeed brought into law, then, as I said, it will probably all be dead. This whole idea of a reconciliation, a rapprochement, a normalization between Russia and the United States will finally be dead. So there it is. That, I think, is what this is all about. I think that Ian Proud has clarified the position very well in this latest article. Anyway, that's what I think. As I said, I think that we are probably ending this brief moment when it looked as if a normalization of relations between America and Russia was a genuine possibility. None of that, of course, is going to help Ukraine. In fact, on the contrary, the situation for Ukraine continues to deteriorate. And today, over the last couple of days, in fact, last 2 days, there has been a cascade of powerful articles in, of all places, the British media, which finally acknowledge this truth. There's been a long article in the Financial Times talking about the increasingly repressive and dictatorial methods that Zelensky is taking against his political opponents in Kiev. The article is most unusual in its criticisms of Zelensky and criticizing his increasingly authoritarian methods. There was a similar, though slightly softer article in The Guardian, but by far the most powerful article in this series is one which has appeared in The Spectator, which I should say is by far the most important political affairs magazine in Britain, once edited by no less a person than Boris Johnson, just saying. But anyway, this article, its title is Ukrainians Have Lost Faith in Zelensky, and it is by Owen Matthews. And the article contains comments like this: Putin chose war over peace this spring because his spies and generals told him that Ukraine is on the brink of collapse. Well, Owen Matthews cannot know what Putin's spies and generals have been telling Putin, but anyway, that's what he thinks they were probably telling him. But then he goes on to say this: alarmingly, they may be right. Ukraine is running out of fighting men. Its frontline soldiers are exhausted, and US military support has narrowed to focus on air defense. The Kiev government, interesting formulation of words, Kiev government rather than the Ukrainian government, is closer to the form of language that the Russians use. Of course, they speak now exclusively of the Kiev regime. To say it straightforwardly, immediately, I think this is pure chance. I absolutely do not think that Owen Matthews is taking this phrase from the Russians. It's just that even he is now starting to think in these terms. Anyway, the Kiev government is racked by corruption scandals and purges, and there is in fact a major reshuffle underway. Zelensky has just addressed the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. He has confirmed that Umerov has been given the boot and has been exiled to Washington as ambassador. I'm being a bit strong there, but that's what it amounts to. He's been packed off to Washington. He's no longer defense minister or presumably chief negotiator. I myself think that the Istanbul process is effectively dead. We'll come to that shortly. Shmyhal is the new defense minister. The new Prime Minister is indeed somebody who is an associate of Yermak. Anyway, the purges continue. Public faith in their future, that's the Ukrainian people's future, and in their leaders is tanking. Those are words, Owen Matthews' words, not mine. And Owen Matthews has been a consistent supporter of Ukraine. And pressure to make peace at almost any price is growing. And he then goes on to say this: if the war continues, soon there will be no Ukraine left to fight for. One former senior official in Zelensky's administration tells me. They now believe their former boss is prolonging the war to hold on to power. Well, we've been saying that on the Duran for some time. Alex and I have done several programs pointing out that, in fact, holding on to power is now the Kiev government's priority, Zelensky's and Yermak's priority. They're not focused any longer so much on winning the war or achieving a satisfactory peace. They want to cling on to control of Ukraine right up until the moment of any eventual collapse, at which time their plan is to decamp en masse to the west and form whatever government they can there, either to the west of Ukraine, to Lvov, assuming the Russians never go there, or if the Russians do go there, further west still in some European capital. Anyway, they now believe, I'm going back to Owen Matthews, they now believe their former boss is prolonging the war to hold on to power. Even once staunch pro-Zelensky cheerleaders, such as Maria Berlinska, not to be confused with Mariana Bezuglaya, head of the Aerial Reconnaissance Support Center, a prominent Ukrainian volunteer movement, expressed despair. We are hanging over the abyss, Berlinska said recently. Ukraine is an expendable pawn in an American game. Trump, Putin, Xi will spend us like small change if they need to. Ukrainian morale, admirably high for much of the war, is collapsing. Again, these are Owen Matthews' comments, they're not mine. Back in October 2022, even after 6 months of violence and bloodshed, 88% of Ukrainians believed that they would be a flourishing country inside the EU within a decade. Now, 47% think that Ukraine will be a depopulated country with a ruined economy. A separate survey found that 70% of Ukrainians also believe their leaders are using the war to enrich themselves. Nothing is more corrosive to wartime morale than the idea that a nation's leaders are stealing as its people fight and die. And the article has an awful lot more to say. It talks about the attempts to sack Budanov and how Zelensky has repeatedly tried to do this, allegedly because of Budanov's growing popularity. And, well, there's a lot more of it than that. Now, this is an article behind a paywall, and it's a long article, and it says an awful lot of things, but I don't feel that I should write, or I should read more, because, as I said, it is paywalled, and if you want to read the article itself, which I would urge you to, if you're prepared to pay the subscription, then, well, it's in The Spectator. Anyway, there we are. All of this is the real situation in Ukraine, according to Owen Matthews. Articles in the Financial Times and The Guardian are saying the same thing. All the information I'm getting from Ukraine myself says the same thing. I pointed out in recent programs that I'm even receiving information now from a soldier within one of the nationalist battalions. To make it clear, this person didn't reach out to me. But anyway, I'm not going to explain how we did get in touch with each other. The fact is he is prepared to provide that information even to someone like me, whose views, of course, he is aware of. So this is the situation in Ukraine now. Nothing that has happened over the last week or 2 weeks can change this. The Patriot missiles are not there. As I've said already, Donald Trump cannot conjure up weapons that do not exist. That is impossible. Merz and Trump might have cooked up a scheme together to send weapons to Ukraine, with the Europeans paying for them. But all that's going to mean is that Ukraine is going to get fewer weapons. They're going to just dribble in small quantities. Nothing about this arrangement has been sorted out yet. I've explained, I hope, in this program, drawing heavily on what Ian Proud has been writing, what I think the true purpose of the sanctioning of Russia Act actually is all about. It's not even about Ukraine. It's about preventing Trump from making peace with the enemy, which is in effect Russia. None of this, however, is going to help Ukraine. Ukraine is indeed being sacrificed whole to the obsessions, the anti-Russian obsessions of certain Western leaders, and to the interests of certain people in Ukraine itself. The war is being prolonged, and it is no longer even about Ukraine. As we see, even in Ukraine itself, the sentiment is, well, the pressure, according to Owen Matthews, I don't want to misrepresent it, the pressure, even according to Owen Matthews, is increasing to make peace at almost any price. In other words, even to agree to the Russian terms. Now, that then brings me back to the negotiations, because Peskov has again been speaking about the fact that the Russians proposed another meeting with the Ukrainians on the 22nd of June, but the Ukrainians didn't go. We're now weeks away from that date, and there's still no sign that the Ukrainians are coming. After Trump's announcements on Monday, the Russians, Peskov and others, have been saying, well, why are you putting all this pressure on us, on Russia? We are prepared to negotiate. It's the Ukrainians who are not sending a delegation to meet with our people and to discuss our memorandum. And of course, when they discuss our memorandum, we will respond to Ukraine's memorandum as well. We are prepared to meet and negotiate with the Ukrainians. It is the Ukrainians who are not. So, despite that, as we can see, there is no move to conduct negotiations on Ukraine's side. One way of looking at this reshuffle that Zelensky has just undertaken is that it was an elaborate and overcomplicated way of sacking his chief negotiator, Rustem Umerov, by sending him to Washington to act as Ukraine's ambassador there, whilst somebody like Schmeichel is put in place to replace him. So, no negotiations. The war is being lost. The situation for Ukraine is getting worse. And everything continues to be frozen. Putin, to repeat again, I am convinced, did not want this outcome. That was why he negotiated with the Ukrainians back in 2022. That is why he was prepared to negotiate with the Ukrainians this year. That is why he was prepared to talk to Donald Trump. But this is the situation we are now looking at. And to be frank, as I said, everything looks at the moment very bleak. I cannot myself see how things are going to change. Now, here I'm going to discuss again an event that took place about a week ago, which is the meeting between Kaja Kallas and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. This is the meeting where, according to the South China Morning Post, Wang Yi told Kaja Kallas that China would not sit back and let Russia lose in Ukraine, because China was well aware that if Russia were to lose, the Europeans and the Americans would be coming after China next. I've heard an awful lot more about this meeting from Chinese sources, and in particular, I should acknowledge this, from Sofia Midkiff from Small Town Voice. And this meeting apparently has been massively discussed across Chinese media, including, of course, Chinese social media. And there is apparently little dispute in China about what actually happened. It turns out that Kaja Kallas came to this meeting with a 37-page document, which she presented to Wang Yi. She had not sent this document to Wang Yi in advance. The document was basically a catalogue of China's sins, according to Kaja Kallas. The first and biggest section of it, unsurprisingly, was about China's support for Russia's aggression in Ukraine, though every other conceivable wrong that China is ever alleged to have committed by anybody in the West was there as well. The meeting proceeded with Kaja Kallas apparently trying to go through this extraordinary document to an utterly incredulous Wang Yi. It then turned out, to Kaja Kallas' alarm, that Wang Yi, who is one of the most professional and consummate diplomats around, and who is always incredibly briefed and well informed. Anyway, it turned out that Wang Yi had all the facts at his fingertips. He didn't need a 37-page document to respond to all of Kaja Kallas' comments. For example, just from what I understand, when Kaja Kallas complained about drone supplies by China to Russia, he pointed out he had all the data from the Chinese customs pointing out that actually drones and drone components, the supply of them from China to Russia has actually been dwindling and has fallen sharply over the course of this year as the Russians have increasingly localized production. Whereas imports of drones and drone components from China by the EU has been skyrocketing over the same period this year. Wang Yi apparently even was able to lecture Kaya Kallas on specific points about the Treaty of Lisbon, which ultimately created Kaya Kallas's job and is the substitute for a EU constitution. Anyway, he had all of the facts at his fingertips. Anyway, it seems that Kaya Kallas, and this is all, of course, based on Chinese sources, no doubt she would have a different account to make. But apparently, Kaya Kallas got increasingly agitated. She started threatening Wang Yi with sanctions, speaking about various individuals and corporations in China that the EU intended to sanction. Wang Yi again pointed to previous agreements in which the EU had agreed with China that trade issues between China and the EU would never be politicized. Apparently, that made Kaya Kallas even more agitated. At some point, she got so agitated that she knocked over a cup of coffee in the table that they were meeting, and the coffee spilled, and apparently some of the coffee got onto the sleeve of Wang Yi's jacket. Anyway, the meeting ended after 4 hours with Wang Yi only agreeing to a picture on the assurance from Kaya Kallas that the EU would not be moving forward with the sanctions against the individuals that she mentioned over the course of the meeting. This after 4 hours. Now, I presume that Kaya Kallas gave that assurance, but of course, she's not going to honour it. The sanctions are going to happen. Anyway, word of how badly the meeting went apparently circulated, and the German foreign minister apparently hurried to meet with Wang Yi later in order to repair some of the damage. Now, there's been articles appearing in the British media commenting about Kaya Kallas's inadequacies as the EU's High Representative on Foreign Policy, and I suspect that rumours of what happened in this meeting are circulating, and I want to stress again, I'm taking all of this information from Chinese sources, so it could be that it wasn't quite as bad as these reports say, but I suspect it was pretty bad. Anyway, the point is, criticisms of Kaya Kallas are circulating, but there is no sign either that she is under threat or that her bosses, Ursula von der Leyen, survived a vote of no confidence in the European Parliament. The vote against her did significantly increase, but one doesn't get the sense that she's under any serious political pressure. Merz, Macron and Starmer all remain committed to this hardline policy against Russia. When we are led by leaders like this, how can anybody seriously expect change? So there it is. It looks to me as if the conflict is going to go on. The only person who I suspect is going to be genuinely pleased by that outcome is Zelensky. His army is being hammered in Ukraine, but the pressure on him that seemed to be there at the start of this year, after Donald Trump was inaugurated, is now off. The Senate clearly doesn't want to see an agreement, a normalization of relations between between the United States and Russia. It looks like it's going to get what it wants. The deep state, the permanent state in the United States, doesn't want that normalization. And the European leaders don't want it either. There's an incredible title to an article, I believe it's in Politico, which talks about a meeting that's now taking place between Starmer and Merz, in which they're going to sign further defense cooperation agreements with each other. And the article's title, which is rather sour, is that Starmer and Merz are now in that place where they feel happy, that place being war. They are happy that the war goes on. I confess that I continue to be shocked by this. I think that in the future, the people of Europe are going to be incredibly angry, bitterly angry about what has happened. I would not be surprised if the same is true of the United States. Heavens knows what people in Ukraine will one day be thinking. But anyway, the war grinds on. Now, saying that, there has actually been quite a lot of news from the battlefronts. Last night, again, the Russians hammered Ukraine. There was a major drone and missile strike against Ukraine last night. As I understand it, it was Dnipro, the city of Dnipro, that was the main target. The Ukrainians have been launching their own drone attack against Russia. Fairly ineffectual from what I can tell. Ukrainian drones are nowhere near as powerful as the Russian ones are, and these drone offensives are nowhere near as well organized, and the Russian air defenses, of course, are immeasurably more powerful. There remains speculation that Ukraine might launch its own homemade missiles against Ukraine, homemade missiles which might, of course, be identical to the Taurus missiles which Germany says it isn't delivering. But I don't expect those missile strikes, if they happen, to make any significant difference. And meanwhile, the battle goes on. And the Russians continue to put the pressure on every part of the front lines. The most severe pressure continues to be on Pokrovsk. It's very difficult to get detailed information about what is happening around Pokrovsk because the Russian Defense Ministry clearly has now a policy of clamping down on information about it, but it looks as if Ukrainian defenses in Udachnye, southwest of Pokrovsk, have collapsed, and that the Ukrainians are probably pulling out of Udachnye. There's apparently intensifying fighting happening in the southern areas of Pokrovsk. There is a rather sad, well, very sad commentary by a Ukrainian soldier saying that the Ukrainian defenders of Pokrovsk are being attacked from every direction and are feeling increasingly exhausted. He reports, there are other reports actually, it wasn't from this soldier, there are other reports that the Russians are now in the process of storming a large coal mine and slag heap just northwest of Novoekonomichny. Apparently this is the Krasno-Limansky mine, not to be confused in any way with the town of Liman, which is located further east, just saying. But anyway, the Russians are supposedly in the process of storming this mine. If they do capture it, then the Ukrainian position to the west in the town of Rodinske will become unsustainable. The Ukrainians will lose Rodinske. And there are some reports that the Ukrainians have pulled out completely from Novo Ekonomiczne itself, though I can't confirm that. And I suspect that there are, in fact, still Ukrainians there. And there's been other fighting in other places. Yunakivka, apparently there's now visual confirmation of the presence of Russian troops in the southern central part of Yunakivka in Sumy region. It does look as if the Russians are indeed quietly advancing in Yunakivka. There were reports that the Ukrainians had abandoned their positions there and that the Ukrainians are holding the Russians back, not in Yunakivka itself, but by holding certain elevations to the south of Yunakivka. This latest report, it seems to me, is consistent with that. There's also reports that the Russians have gained significant ground in Volchansk, in Kharkiv region, and that they're advancing in other parts of Kharkiv region as well. There are also reports that the Russians have tightened further the ring around Kupiansk. Apparently there's been heavy fighting going on inside Kupiansk for a while, and again there is restrictions. There are very, very tight restrictions, clearly from both sides, as to what is actually taking place there. And lastly, there are more advances by the Russians towards the Dnieper, into Dnipropetrovsk region, and apparently the Russians maybe have now gained control of a village called Sherbinovka, located to the west of Toretsk. The Russians briefly held this village for a time whilst the Battle of Toretsk was underway. The Ukrainians then recaptured it. They've held it ever since, even though Toretsk itself has fallen. It's in that same area where Ukrainian troops have been basically surrounded for some time. It looks as if this village has once again passed under Russian control, and that the area south of Konstantinovka that the Ukrainians still retain has shrunk significantly. So, as I said, these battles continue, the Russian advances continue. You get these incredibly plaintive comments from the Ukrainians as well. Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, has published a plaintive report complaining that Ukrainian commanders are increasingly lying about the military situation across the battlefronts, and that this is making it more and more difficult to assess the truth of what is really happening, so that the situation could be even worse, could be worse than Deep State says. I'm not going to say, by the way, that the Russian commanders have not at various times done the same thing also. But, of course, the Russians can overcome the problems created by that. The Ukrainians, it's doubtful whether they can. The Battle of Pokrovsk is now clearly being waged with full intensity. I don't know how long it's going to last. Probably not that long. At least that's my guess. And as I said, I suspect that when Pokrovsk falls, the tide, if you like, will surge. Anyway, that's my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.